The United States announced one of its most aggressive sets of sanctions in recent memory, this time aimed squarely at Moscow's energy backbone. The administration levied restrictions on two major Russian oil companies, signaling an escalation in pressure on the Kremlin and an appeal to Europe to join the cause. The US president declared, "The United States is fully prepared to impose a very strong round of powerful tariffs, which would stop the bloodshed. For those tariffs to be effective, European nations, all of you are gathered here right now, would have to join us in adopting the exact same measures." He pressed the point. They want to see it end too. They really want to see it end. But I can say they're totally committed. If this went on for 10 more years, Europe is behind them. They just can't let that happen. His remarks came as European institutions signalled matching resolve. In Brussels, the European Parliament's President Roberta Metsola weighed in, underscoring the unity of purpose between Europe and the US in confronting Russia's aggression. We sanctioned two major Russian oil and gas companies. They're massively trying to sell off some of their gas station outlets in the US. The interviewer prompted, asking whether this move would strike cut to the bone with Russia. Metsola replied, "Well, it will definitely go one step further in crippling Russia's war machine. It is something that we've been working on ever since day one, because we realized and recognized that Ukraine's security is Europe's and also the world, including the United States' security," she went on. There was a reality at the very beginning of the war that there were some countries that were almost completely dependent on Russia for gas. And that was an immediate pivot away by the European Union towards countries like the United States, which we thank also for having been with us at every step of the way. But also understand that if we need to diversify, we had for too long been relying on unpredictable neighbours who think they can invade one of our other neighbours. That was not the way to go. During the interview, attention shifted to Europe's energy dependence. 69% of your energy comes from fossil fuels. 1.3 billion a month, your purchases of Russian fossil fuels. The interviewer asked, "Why isn't it possible to go to zero? Couldn't we backfill you? Have we offered to be the primary provider? Is that a practical solution?" Metsola was clear. The idea is to go to zero. In fact, the entry into force of the pieces of legislation will have been brought forward to the end of 2026. She recalled a recent meeting with US Energy Secretary Chris Wright. How as a Europe can we move from unpredictable partners to predictable and allies? And the United States is one of them. This, of course, does not exclude that we pursue clean energy, but absolutely no more dependence, and that will not happen again on Russia. When asked about a proposed trade deal, 15% import tariff on most EU goods, no tariffs on US exports, the EU to invest $600 billion in the US, purchase $750 billion in US energy, 50% tariff on EU steel and aluminium, Metsola framed it in broader strategic terms. She said the deal is part of the discussions I'm having, first on the Hill, and also with US businesses who invest in Europe, and European businesses who invest in the US, because our trade deal is the largest in the world. We are the #1 trading partners of each other, and this deal gives the predictability that we had long been seeking. She noted that the European Parliament, with its 720 members, will scrutinise implementation, but by and large we can see that there is potential for growth. We are open for business, she added, and much more dependable than China. And it's a great message to send China, especially on the eve of a big meeting tomorrow. As the conversation ended, she reinforced the underlying message. Europe is recalibrating, not just to fight a war of diplomacy and sanctions, but to reset the structural ties that bind energy, trade and security. This exchange captures a moment of strategic alignment between the US and EU on Ukraine energy and trade. Several elements stand out. Sanctions as leverage. The US move to sanction Rosneft and Lukoil is sharper than many previous efforts, targeting not just Russian state-owned firms, but key revenue streams. As analysts note, the ripple effects go far. Overseas assets could be sold off, partners may freeze out Russian firms, and the shadow of secondary sanctions looms. Energy independence and diversification. Metsola's remarks highlight a fundamental shift in Europe's energy sourcing. The dependency on Russian fossil fuels, vast in some nations, has been exposed as a critical strategic vulnerability. The goal of going to zero dependence on Russia is ambitious, but now appears embedded in legislation and policy timelines end of 2026. Trade and geostrategy. The reference trade framework between the US and EU is portrayed less as pure commerce and more as part of a security economic architecture where preferential tariffs, investment flows and energy procurement serve as instruments of geopolitical alignment. Message to Beijing. The interviewer and Metsola both emphasize a contrast with China, Europe as more dependable, signaling that the US-EU axis is sharpening with China firmly in view as a competitor or challenger. Russia's response. While not in the transcript itself, public statements from Moscow suggest the Kremlin sees sanctions as hostile but intends to push ahead. President Vladimir Putin has publicly said Russia will not bow to pressure, though he conceded some losses may follow. Risk and reward. The sanctions carry significant risk, especially for European countries still heavily reliant on Russian energy or without readily available alternatives. The US is positioning itself as a source of reliability, but this will require infrastructure and transition investments, plus political management within Europe. Timeline and implementation. The EU's ban on Russian LNG imports by the end of 2026 or January 2027 for long-term contracts is a clear signal, but it also reveals the gradual nature of the shift. A transition phase remains during which Russia will seek to exploit residual markets, India, China, and alternative logistics. Parliamentary oversight. Metsola mentioned that the European Parliament will examine the trade deal carefully, indicating that while political momentum is strong, legal and procedural scrutiny remains. The functioning of the EU democratic machinery is part of the story. In recent days, the political, economic and security pillars of the US-EU relationship have converged around one clear goal: to increase pressure on Russia and to reduce Europe's own strategic dependence on Moscow's energy exports. Throughout the interview, Roberta Metsola portrayed Europe not as a passive bystander, but as an active partner in a broader transatlantic realignment. Whether through sanctions, energy diversification or trade deals, the message is unambiguous. The old patterns of energy dependence, unpredictability and strategic drift are being replaced. The stakes are high. If the sanctions work and Europe achieves a meaningful shift in energy sourcing, Moscow's war economy may face real strain. If the transition is mismanaged or delayed, the vulnerabilities exposed by Ukraine's war may reverberate far beyond Europe's borders. At the heart of this story is a simple but urgent recalibration. Europe must choose not just who supplies its energy and trade, but also how those choices align with its security and values. And in that context, the US stands ready to partner, but the timelines, investments and political will be tested in the months ahead.